So. ¿Quieres empezar yo? Empiezo yo. ¿Anda? ¿O cómo se hace? Hola, ¿se escucha?
Oh, perfecto.
Ok.
Bueno, empecemos.
Ok, muy buenas tardes. Vamos a pasar al inglés. Good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining us here. I would like to extend a warm welcome to the Ambassador of Ireland, Gregory McCoy, and our guest, Alan Barrett. Thank you, our Marcelo Elizondo and Francisco. We will begin with the salutation from our president, Francisco de Santibáñez, and then we will continue with presentation of our ambassador. And then Mr. Alan Barrett will speak for approximately 20 minutes. After his remarks, we will move on listening to our Marcelo Elizondo, and who will make some comments and ask questions to Alan. After that, once the questions are complete, we will open the floor for questions from you. Please raise the hand to ask questions to the speakers. And very important, I remind you, try to be very specifically when you are making questions. So maybe I'm going to do a brief introduction to the CVs, to our expositor, Alan Barrett. Now I'm going to change to Spanish, to switch to Spanish. Alan Barrett, director del Economic and Social Research Institute, donde lidera la misión de realizar investigaciones económicas y sociales sobre temas claves de Irlanda para informar las políticas públicas. Es doctor en economía por la Michigan State University, se unió al ESRI en 1994, ha investigado principalmente en economía laboral, economía de población y macroeconomía, con publicaciones en revistas como Labor Economics, Journal of Population Economy y Oxford Review of Economy Policy. Fue el autor principal del Quarterly Economic Commentary del ESRI y coautor de un libro sobre economía ambiental en 1997. Es miembro de la Royal Irish Academy, investigador asociado del ITSA de Bonn, Honorary Fellow de la Society of Actuaries en Irlanda y profesor adjunto en Trinity College Dublin. También fue miembro del Irish Fiscal Advisory Council y del Climate Change Advisory Council y ha presidido el National Economic Dialogue entre el 2015 y el 2021. Participa frecuentemente en medios como The New York Times y The Economist, y hoy lo tenemos acá en la Casa del CAN. Marcelo, sí. Marcelo Elizondo es presidente del Comité Argentino de la International Chamber of Commerce, director de la maestría en Dirección Estratégico-Tecnológico y profesor de Estrategias Competitivas Internacionales en ITPA, presidente del capítulo argentino de la International Society for Performance Improvement desde 2012. Presidente de la sección internacional del LIDE Argentina, miembro del Consejo Directivo de la Cámara Argentina de Comercio y Servicios, director del Comité de Economía Internacional del CARI y miembro del Consejo Consultivo del CIPEC. Fundó y dirige la consultora DNI, Desarrollo de Negocios Internacionales. Pero ahora escuchemos a Francisco, por favor.
Gracias, Connie. Tan solo para darle la bienvenida al profesor Barro. Bienvenido al CARI y a la Argentina. Agradecerle una vez más a la Embajada de Irlanda y a su embajador por esta iniciativa en conjunto y por la buena relación que mantenemos de trabajo. Y por supuesto a Marcelo, que es el director del Comité de Economía Internacional del CARI, y a Connie, que es la directora del Comité de Asuntos Europeos. Solo diría, me gustaría destacar la importancia del caso irlandés, no solo como un caso teórico de desarrollo, de los más exitosos que han tenido lugar en las últimas décadas, sino que también puede ser un espejo pensando en una Argentina que se desarrolle, que crezca, para entender cómo podríamos hacer eso y también entender las diferencias con el caso irlandés. que parte del éxito a la hora de pensar un modelo de desarrollo es entender las diferencias con otros países, qué se puede llevar adelante, qué no se puede llevar adelante por diferencias culturales, económicas, de épocas, geográficas, etc. Algunos puntos a destacar que seguramente se hablarán es el gran crecimiento que lleva adelante Irlanda desde la década del 90, la cantidad de inversión extranjera directa que ha recibido, que esto se debe a muchas causas, podrán discutirlo, estamos hablando hace poco, que van desde la baja tasa impositiva para las empresas, la estabilidad de saber que esas tasas se van a respetar en el tiempo, debido a los acuerdos políticos, la inversión en la educación, en la fuerza laboral, como pilar para el desarrollo en mediano largo plazo, las posibilidades comerciales que tienen que ver con la pertenencia a la Unión Europea, pero hablamos también de la inmigración irlandesa a Estados Unidos y los lazos que eso genera en las economías, que el poder blando, soft power, este atractivo de Irlanda en especial para la industria tecnológica, farmacéutica, y por supuesto también los dilemas que genera el desarrollo económico. Cómo posicionar al sector alimenticio dentro de un desarrollo económico, las desigualdades regionales que puede generar el crecimiento económico, el crecimiento económico y cómo eso afecta al precio de la propiedad, que es un gran dilema que enfrenta hoy en día Irlanda, como también el costo de vida. Y un tema que seguramente el profesor Barrett va a mencionar, también el rol de las instituciones inclusivas como un factor determinante para el desarrollo de esto. Así que de vuelta, agradecerles a todos por estar hoy presentes y en especial al profesor Barrett.
Ahora sí, embajador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Many thanks for your kind remarks and good evening. As Ambassador of Ireland in Argentina, it's a great pleasure to be here at CARI this evening. I would like to thank all here at CARI for their cooperation with the Embassy in organizing this event, particularly President Francisco Santibáñez, Cornelia Schmidt-Lehrmann, and Marcelo Elizondo. It is a particular pleasure for us at the Embassy to welcome to Buenos Aires Professor Alan Barrett of the Economic and Social Research Institute, which is Ireland's leading think tank. This is Professor Barrett's first visit to Argentina, and this is his third major presentation in Buenos Aires. Having arrived early last Friday morning, Professor Barrett gave a presentation at the University of Di Tella on Friday afternoon, as well as a discussion at CPEC earlier this morning. So I do hope on behalf of all of us that you have had some opportunity to discover a little of the delights of Buenos Aires over the weekend. Argentina holds a special place for us in Ireland, as it is home to the largest diaspora of Irish heritage in all of Latin America. Some 500,000 Argentines are of Irish descent. Ireland's first embassy in all of Latin America opened in Buenos Aires in 1948. And every year, we at the embassy are fortunate to welcome a senior member of the Irish government to Argentina to celebrate our national holiday, St. Patrick's Day, with the Irish Argentine community and the many friends of Ireland. Our current president, as well as his two immediate predecessors, have each visited Argentina in acknowledgement of the importance which we in Ireland attach to our relationship with Argentina. Last year, we in Ireland marked our 50th anniversary of joining the European Union on the 1st of January 1973. Our membership of the European Union has been fundamental to the economic, social, and political transformation which we have seen in Ireland over the past 50 years or so. In addition, the European Union has played a key role in the peace process in Northern Ireland, culminating in the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Looking to the future, Ireland is committed to developing our long-standing and historic links with Argentina, both bilaterally and as a full and equal member state of the European Union. In conclusion, I would like to thank my colleagues at the Embassy of Ireland for all of their hard work in preparing for this event with our friends at CARI, and of course, a particular word of thanks to Professor Barrett for taking the time to join us here this evening to share his thoughts on Ireland's economy. Thank you very much.
Alan, it's your turn.
Great, thank you very much. So let me begin by, I want to thank the Embassy again for the opportunity to come and visit, and thank CARI specifically then for the invitation to come and chat a little bit. So this is, I know we use the word presentation or chat, so we'll consider this more a chat and talk through the issues. I think in some ways, a good way for me to motivate things a little bit is just to say that I was born in Ireland in 1968. I went to secondary school and college in the 1980s. And in 1989, I graduated from Fine University in Dublin, Trinity College, Dublin, and I went off to the United States to study. And I did so never expecting to go back to Ireland. Okay, now that's only 35 years ago, but I genuinely mean that. Okay, the Ireland that I grew up in the 70s and in the 80s was a pretty depressed place. Okay, especially in the 1980s, we had extremely high unemployment. We had very, very high emigration. And it really was a sort of a dull and depressing place to be. And a lot of that was simply to do with the economic conditions of the time. Okay, so Ireland had had a sort of a patchy 20th century, if I can put it like that. But in the 1980s, we really got stuck in something that, if I use the phrase, a sort of a fiscal crisis, an Argentinian audience, I think, will understand this. So we began the 1980s with a severe fiscal crisis. Our expenditures vastly exceeded the tax revenues that were entering the state. The national debt grew quite considerably. And we had a policy program then for the 1980s where the government continually talked about the need to correct the public finances, but they never really achieved it. Okay, and you ended up then in a sense with the worst of all worlds. Okay, because you had a bad fiscal situation, you had a government that wasn't dealing with it, but because it was talking about it all the time, everybody had this sense that an economic correction was going to happen, that severe action was going to be required. And so the lack of policy forcefulness, if I can put it like that, meant that there was no appetite for investment, be it domestic or foreign. And so Ireland really sort of drifted through the 1980s. Okay, and we still use the phrase the lost decade. Okay, I came from a family of 6 children. I think in 1989, 5 of the 6 were living outside of Ireland. Okay, so we were almost like just a classic illustration. Okay, so if you had told me 35 years later that I'd be sitting in front of an audience in Buenos Aires talking about the Irish success, I would not have believed that this was possible. Okay, so then the question is, well, what happened? Okay, partly over my lifetime, that we moved from that position where I thought I was leaving a country never to return, that obviously things have turned around quite dramatically. Okay, so needless to say, the fiscal issue got dealt with, okay, but we might talk about that a little bit more in a few moments. But really what happened, okay, is that Ireland, even going back before the 1980s, okay, for a long time, had a policy approach and a policy desire, okay, that the economy should be extremely outward looking. Okay, and by that I mean we recognize that we're a very, very small country. Okay, so there was a need in order to generate economic development to ensure that we became an exporting economy. Okay, there was no point trying to do things on our own as a small little bit. We have to be export oriented. And we also needed foreign direct investment. Okay, there simply would not have been the funding within Ireland to generate the sort of economic growth that we needed. Okay, so that desire for export orientation and an FDI inflow, which in a sense is sort of defines globalization. Ireland had that policy and that desire going back to the 1960s and the 1970s. But in the 1980s, in spite of the policy ambition, we had this blockage of this fiscal difficulty, which meant that we were just not going to get the sort of investment that we really, really craved. Okay, so what started happening then, okay, when things started going better, when we removed that fiscal difficulty, then all of a sudden it was possible to see the sort of investment that we required. All right. And this really brings us then to the sort of story that I think people are now all familiar with. It was the inflow of very significant amounts of foreign direct investment into Ireland. Okay, so again, why did this happen? Okay, lots of countries were looking for foreign direct investment. Why was Ireland good at getting it? Corporation tax has got to be a central part of this story. Okay, Ireland decided, again, a long time ago, that we would have a low rate of corporation tax. It was 12.5%, okay, which was substantially below our competitor economies. Okay, and that was clearly very, very attractive to companies that wanted to invest and make profits in Ireland. Okay, but I absolutely believe, and I think most people in my position would agree with this, that without a whole range of other features, the corporation tax was important, okay, but it wouldn't have worked if a whole range of other things were not in place. So what were the other things that were in place? Okay, the first thing I have to mention is membership of the European Union. Okay, the membership of the European Union is really, really central to the Irish growth story, and for a whole range of reasons. Okay, the first reason is that the European Union is essentially a free trade area. Okay, so Ireland, in a sense, through its membership of the European Union, was involved in a free trade area, and so its economy had moved onto a footing that, you know, we couldn't have protective tariffs on goods coming into Ireland, and we had to organize ourselves in the sense that we could just compete within the European Union. Okay, and that's a really important thing for an economy, actually, not just in terms of making sure that consumers have, say, goods and services at the lowest possible cost, but when you're subject to free trade like that, it enforces sort of an agility and an efficiency in the economy that perhaps would not have been there had it not been for European Union membership. Also, when a lot of American companies came to invest in Ireland, and I'll continue to say American companies, because while there was a significant inflow of FDI, a lot of it was, and still is American, they often wanted a presence in the European Union. Okay, so they, in a sense, were jumping over the tariff wall, were in the European Union market, and that could export for it. Okay, so we've got the European Union providing a free trade environment, access to the EU market. But again, I'm going to push this a little bit further and say other things the European Union did was provide a sort of a framework for sensible policy. Okay, and again, I actually think this matters enormously to foreign direct investors. Okay, so because the EU had competence in a variety of areas, for example, competition law, the single currency matters here, the sort of fiscal discipline that was imposed on us, there was a range of structures where Ireland essentially had to have reasonably sane and sensible policy and policy processes, which again, I think just sort of added a credibility to the environment into which people were investing. Okay, countries on their own can try and create these sort of things, but it's almost like that when you had the umbrella of the union, it just sort of created a broader and sort of more stable environment. Okay, so try and hold those sort of thoughts in your head. FDI into Ireland, yes, corporation tax mattered, but if you think in terms of a sane, sensible system overlaid by the European Union, okay, I think you get a sort of a sense then of this sort of broader comfort or whatever like that that was provided to people who were foreign direct investments. Just to say, like on this, if you look at the figures, like Ireland is astoundingly successful at getting foreign direct investment. Okay, so if you look at charts of these sort of things, okay, and you compare across countries, it really is remarkable how well we have actually done. Okay, and again, to make the point, it is primarily American money. Okay, so that's that. Let me move on just to a second block of, okay, so my first sort of block was telling you about where the foreign direct investment, how it came about. And again, we can fill that out in the conversation. A second block, though, I want to talk about social policies for a second here as well, because again, I think this is important. I'm not sure how many people in the room are economists, okay, but very, very often economists get hung up on this sort of notion that there's an inherent trade-off between economic growth and equality. Okay, and it's almost the case that if your policies are very growth-oriented, very pro-business, low tax, and all those sort of things, that you can't have equality, which is all about higher taxes to redistribute and stuff like that. Okay, let me assure, Ireland has demonstrated that you can have growth and you can have increasing equality. So if you look at the data, that, you know, again, standard measures of equality like Gini coefficients, or if you measure the incomes of the top decile to the lower decile, you'll see throughout the 90s and the 2000s, Ireland exhibited declines in these things, which is quite remarkable. And if you, if anybody wants to see this, I'll send the graph onto them. So if anybody wants to ask me later about it, but a colleague of mine has produced a graph over a number of years, which looks sort of does an across-country comparison, and shows very, very clearly that Ireland uniquely managed to increase incomes quite substantially over the sort of the earlier part of this century, while reducing inequality. All right, so it is possible to happen. Okay, it didn't happen by accident. These were very proactive policy choices. The taxation, especially the income taxation system. Okay, so we might have low corporation taxes, but we've actually higher income taxes with very progressive income taxes. And allied then with the social safety net, we have really been able to sort of engineer a situation in which inequality has been reduced. And in this context, I also want to talk about education just for a brief second. You can talk about education as an economic policy or as a social policy. So I just put it in as a social policy here. But going back to the 1960s, the Irish government has really proactively sought to increase investment in education, to expand the proportion of each cohort that went on, firstly on second level, and then on the third level, and then most recently onto fourth level education as well. So it's a long-running policy, and this is one of these policies, because you can only affect a certain group every year, it can take a long time for the benefits of that policy to build up. But if you look at the data now, you see that Ireland has a very, very high proportion of well-educated people in the workforce. Okay, that's good from an equality perspective, but it's actually very good from an economic perspective as well. Okay, I'm talking in blocks. That was block number 2, 4 blocks in particular. Block number 3 is, I want to talk about some of the mistakes that Ireland made along the way. Okay, I feel it's very, very important for me to be humble here. Okay, I don't want to pretend that Ireland has always and everywhere got everything right. Okay, so I've touched on one of these already, which was the lack of the fiscal adjustment in the 1980s. Okay, and the prolonged difficulties that generated. Okay, more recently, of course, we had a very significant financial collapse. When the world economy had the Great Recession of around 2010 to 2012, Ireland was, if I put it like this, at the forefront, okay, in a bad way. Okay, the damage that was done to us was quite remarkable. And actually, while globalization has been a very positive thing for Ireland, and I talked about the foreign trade and the foreign direct investment, globalization played a really bad role in our collapse. And let me just take a minute to explain why. Okay, so Ireland's economic collapse at that period was a very sort of familiar sort of story, in the sense that you had asset prices increasing, in this case, housing. The banks noticed the increasing house prices, so they were willing to lend to people who were willing to spend ever higher amounts on these houses. There was a sort of an underlying narrative that, well, in growing economies, house prices always go up. So there was this sort of sense of, oh, well, the phrase used to be, well, this can be explained by the fundamentals. But of course, the house prices increased to such a level, and there had been so much money invested, borrowed money invested, that when the collapse came, you ended up in that familiar situation that you had people owing hundreds of thousands, indeed millions, in terms of mortgages on properties that were worth very, very little. Okay, so you're wondering, where does globalization come in here? The answer is, when Ireland joined the euro, okay, and we had a common currency, it created a situation in which the Irish banks could borrow from international banks, and there was no exchange risk. And nothing sort of showed up in the national accounts to suggest that this was in any way problematic. Okay, so Irish banks literally borrowed money from primarily German banks, lent it on to the domestic market. And that was one of the reasons then, when the collapse actually happened, you'll again remember that fears of contagion and all those phrases that were there. Okay, so the Irish collapse really spooked the European Union, and it was partly because so much money was actually owed to Germany. And you can imagine, again, the dynamic that set about. So when the IMF came to Ireland, they came along not on their own. They were joined by the European Commission and the European Central Bank. And this wasn't a sort of philanthropic visit or anything like that. These were the European institutions that were terrified about the prospect of Ireland dragging things down. To this day, there's a little bit of a sort of a residual bit of bad feeling. People felt that the austerity imposed in Ireland was probably excessive. Whether or not it was is a matter for debate. But anyway, it was a difficult time. I should add, as a postscript to that, one of the successes of Ireland, though, was the speed with which we came out of that program. Okay, and to this day, I believe that the reason we successfully managed to get through that difficulty was the memory of the 1980s. So if you remember when I talked about the 1980s, an observation that because we didn't deal with the problems that were then there, we had a lost decade. When the financial collapse happened, there was a general understanding that we needed to get on top of this very, very quickly, which we did. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked. And the result of that then was that the economy actually bounced back remarkably quickly. Okay, and at the end of the first IMF program, there's no need for an extension. There was no need for an additional program. Things moved on very, very quickly. Okay, my last block. I hope that's okay.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect is good. Okay, a word then of what do we worry about now? All right, and this is almost me thinking in terms of, if I am back here in 10 years' time and it's all gone horribly wrong, I'll be able to look you all in the eye and sort of say, well, actually, I was aware that this was a problem. So the thing we worry about now in Ireland, and this might sound slightly strange, we worry, have we been almost too successful in attracting foreign direct investment to Ireland? Okay, now that might sort of seem strange. How could you be too successful? Well, just to give you a couple of sort of figures on this, I mean, it's estimated now about a third of the Irish economy, okay, about a third of our national output is related to foreign companies. Okay, and again, that's quite remarkable internationally. And of course, the worry is, well, what if those international companies one day decide, well, actually, there's another country who's doing all the things that Ireland was doing, but they're going to do it a bit better. Okay. You know, needless to say, your own domestic producers probably have a sense of connection to your country, but international capital is remarkably mobile. So we work hard to make sure, you know, that these companies are staying, or if they're not staying, that they're going to be replaced. But the potential vulnerability is severe. And let me just add to it with the following thought. I've said already that about a third of our economy is related to foreign direct investment. Okay, two sectors account for 80 or 90% of that 30%. Information and communications technology, pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Okay, so I don't know if there's business people in the room generally, but you know that sort of the phrase concentration risk. You should never run your lives in such a way that you're running a concentration risk. That if anything goes wrong in the particular sectors that you're actually particularly exposed to, the buffers are very, very limited. Okay, and just to add that these are not just sort of intellectual or academic worries. Okay, it's not just me sort of thinking out loud. The arrival of Trump in particular has really caused concern. Okay, because Trump has explicitly spoken about his desire to bring jobs back to America, get production back to America, and in a sense to sort of avoid the sort of deficits that he sees with other countries. So there is a real threat out there. So we hope in Ireland, needless to say, we think we've done a pretty good job at generating sort of, wealth and high standards of living for our population. I talked about the distributional issues as well, that it hasn't just been a small group of people that benefited. We've tried to share the benefits. Not everything is perfect, far from it. Housing is a particular difficulty, as I think was mentioned earlier on. The economy has grown to such an extent that the population has grown and housing has lagged behind. So that's a real sort of crunch point at the moment. So there are difficulties, there's no doubt about that. For now, we think we're in a very good place and we think we have a lot of lessons to share. But I'd be lying if I didn't say there's just a few worries. So with that, Chairperson, I'll.
Perfect. You can come again.
Perfect.
But, no, keep posted, Marcelo.
Well, thank you, Alan. Excellent presentation and a lot of ideas to take. We here from Argentina. I was thinking that we are now, in my personal opinion, in a situation that is very similar to your starting point situation in terms of some necessities. Well, some of the reforms are already being implemented in terms of fiscal reforms or regulation reforms or some others. But anyway, there are many things that should be done here in Argentina. So I have some things to remark and some questions to share with you. But first, I would remark the economic reforms you implemented that you say were based on some political consensus, some leadership, but also because of having learned and the experience. And this is something that it was not so common in Argentina. We made a lot of mistakes for many years, but we didn't learn so rapidly. So there are some common problems comparing to your starting point, but there are some different situations that I would like to get your opinion about. I would like to remark also the seduction of foreign direct investments, the seduction of foreign direct investments, the efforts to become an exporting economy. This is something that we must implement, and we didn't do not yet. And I think that is very interesting, and I will ask for some more ideas or information about that. This mix between economic reforms and social reforms, this capacity of mixing some orthodox reforms in terms of free market economy, foreign investments, private sector-based economy, and social reforms in order to, as you said, implement equality policies. So I would like to remark the economic reforms, the corporation taxes reform, that I think that it was basic part of the successful current condition in Ireland. And the additional point is the European Union membership. But this is something very complicated for Argentina. Argentina can implement a lot of reforms in terms of taxes or fiscal policies or deregulating the economy as the current administration is trying to implement. But it is not so easy for us to become member of something like a European Union market. So I think that there are many points in common. There are many points that are in the current administration in Argentina that were in the Irish agenda. But there are some other questions in order to how to join the Irish agenda, especially considering that President Milei, when he was candidate, used to say the Irish model is my model. So I think that is remarkable, and it is something that could be a great example for Argentina in many issues. But there are some other conditions that you got that those are conditions that are not so easy for Argentina. So let me ask you some questions about history and the present. But first, in terms of the process, the first question is, you said that you could implement reforms because of learned about your previous experience. Anyway, it is always very complicated to get consensus and to create leaderships and to generate a political system that can implement reforms and keep those reforms and get those reforms more stable and institutionally based. So my first question is, how would you describe this political process to get those consensus to work, focus on those reforms for many years, 35 years, different administrations, different governments, different political parties? How was this process?
Okay, starting with a tricky question, actually, but let me do my best to answer it. So, okay, so the fundamental question then, again, just to repeat it, this idea that Ireland sort of learned from the past mistakes or whatever like that, and then had the capacity to follow through reforms over a prolonged period of time. Like on the first bit about the ability to learn from the past, I don't think that was difficult. I mean, I think it's and maybe this is a very naive thing to say, but it kind of surprises me that people don't learn from the past. That to me is the mystery. And when the financial crisis hit in 2010, I mean, there were a number of politicians who were still around, who had been around in the late 1980s, and even if they hadn't been politicians in the late 1980s, I think there was a general understanding of what had happened then, and so I think there was an almost, and I remember the conversations at the time. As soon as this happened, senior politicians were saying we are not going to go through the 1980s again, and I think the population understood it and bought into it. So in terms of learning from the past, is that what surprises me is that people don't learn from the past, but maybe again, is that maybe that's naive. The second component to your question, though, is more complicated, and that's the idea of having a sort of a long-term capacity in a system to see reforms through, because a lot of the things we're talking about are reforms that you have to implement over a prolonged period of time. Okay, now in this, actually, Ireland has an advantage that can't be repeated. Okay, and let me just explain. We have almost like a strange politics in Ireland, whereby for the first 100 years of the state, the two leading parties were almost identical ideologically. Okay, so they were both centre-right, and they still are. They're centre-right parties. Okay, and essentially what happened was they grew out of the Civil War. There was a Civil War immediately after independence. Some of the people sort of were prepared to take the treaty that the British offered in 1921. Another group were not prepared to take it. Two political blocs were established. Okay, and even though the Civil War ended 100 years ago, the two major parties, strangely, hung together. And over the years, although governments changed in Ireland, policy actually changed very, very little. And there was like remarkable degrees of consensus when I think about it now about what needed to happen. So that situation was probably unique to Ireland. Okay, so you look at other countries and you say, well, okay, you can't have that sort of Irish political accident. What are you going to do? And I suppose to a certain extent then, and maybe it's impossible, but can countries, even if you're having change of governments, engineer situations where there's an understanding that there are sort of trajectories that the country needs to be on? Okay, so can you collectively in Argentina or another country say, look, you know, we need to invest in education. We need to deregulate. There are broad things we need to do. We can disagree, for example, about social programs. And, you know, if this is successful and there's additional money, we can disagree on whether or not we spend more money on tax cuts or social welfare or, you know, those sort of left-right things. But I think the challenge really, it seems to me, is generating within a society some sort of assured vision of where that society wants to go. And then at least the policy framework is anchored to a certain extent. And then you're having, you know, differences around the central theme. Now, whether or not that only you in this room can answer if that's in any way possible. But I think, as I said, Ireland was very, very lucky. But other countries just have to engineer, I think, some sort of a long run consensus.
When I was speaking about consensus, I was speaking about not just political consensus, but also the agreements you must get from labor unions and companies unions and influential people, you know, social, the society joining the reforms. But let me link this opinion to the second question that is about the social reforms. I would like to get some more information about how you could mix those economic reforms in terms of regulation, taxation, opening the economy, and simultaneously implementing those equality policies, or reducing inequality. How was it?
Yeah.
How you did that?
Yeah, well, again, I think economics as a subject sort of evolved in such a way to describe these things as contradictory almost to one another. But I think more sort of modern and informed thinking sees pro-growth and pro-equality policies as actually being much more complementary, okay, than previously would have been thought. And let me try and give you a sort of concrete example as to how this actually works. Very often, economic policy that aims at deregulating, okay, will impact severely on particular groups. Okay, so if you're going to, say, take protections away from a particular industry or a particular area or whatever like that, clearly there are going to be losers in that situation. Now, obviously, it can be the case that if you're moving the economy generally on a more sort of efficient basis, an economy on average can be growing, but you can have losers, winners and losers, you know, in certain areas. And I think the Irish policy system recognized this a long time ago. And again, I don't want to simplify it and say we got everything right, far from it. But I think there was an understanding that if you're going to have a policy which deregulates and there's a free trade dimension and there are, you know, losers, if I use that sort of blunt term, you can only hope to sustain a program like that and to have that sort of broader sort of societal buy-in that we're talking about, if there is a genuine effort to cushion the blow for a group of people. And there's two main ways you can do that. I mean, one is you can do it by cash transfers. I mean, it's the, you know, the standard social welfare net. And that is very, very important in Ireland. And the other is to invest in people and in communities. And that's partly then about education policy, training policy. It may be, and again, the Irish government that has tried to do this, the spreading of economic activity sort of across the country, a sort of a proactive effort to make sure infrastructure is being developed elsewhere. So, you know, there are this range of tools. They have been very, very important to Ireland. And I think part of it is about that notion of developing the sort of societal buy-in or whatever like that for the ongoing development of the country. And if I can just add a little postscript to that. I was speaking to a group of Americans about a month ago, okay, and I was giving them some of the statistics that I was giving to you, and I made the point about the really sort of size of the American investment in Ireland relative to the economy generally. Okay, and a person in the audience asked the question, was it the case then that the Americans had too much influence in Irish public policy? Okay, they basically were asking, was the Irish government and the policy system afraid to do things that might upset these companies on the basis that they're so important, surely you're not going to do anything that would trouble them? Now, it was a very insightful question, and it was a slightly unsettling question in many ways. But as I was reflecting on it, I mean, I think one of the things I did think about was that a lot of the sort of social type legislation that we have in Ireland wouldn't be entirely typical of a sort of an American corporate view of the world. And I think there is a sort of sense that we want to make sure we do all those sort of things and make those sort of investments because that's what we really believe in. And it's almost sort of troubling to think if we were to, have a slightly different philosophical perspective, that it would always sort of create suspicions that our policies were sort of being generated from elsewhere. So I said, I think they're complementary. If you look at the data, they've really worked. Okay, we've managed to do the two things. And in some ways, I know, people talk about the Irish economic model and focus on the economic growth. But from a personal perspective, I think that aligning it with the equality measures has actually been the great achievement.
Great. Excellent.
You have one question.
One more question. But I have the microphone, I have the power.
That's true.
So I can make a complex question.
Yes.
2 questions, side 1.
Yes.
I was going to win. 2 questions, just one, about present, not the process. First is about your membership, the European Union and your membership to the European Union. Yeah. Many people consider that the European Union is running into a extremely regulation policy. And you've been speaking about deregulating an open market. Are 2 models, are 2 different models in between Ireland and the European Union? This is the first question. And the second one, if you have time, it's maybe about the future. You said that globalization was so good for you. What do you think about the current situation of globalization? Is the world going against globalization? Is this globalization environment being changed, that it is something that is worrying? I mean, this is my last question.
Perfect.
Okay, they're really chunky questions, so I have to say, and very actually interesting and important questions. So let me try and give a brief response to both. Okay, on EU membership, actually, and the extent to which the European Union is perceived as moving in a more regulatory direction. I mean, I think this is really coming into focus now vis-a-vis the United States. And with this, I mean, this debate has happened for years. There's always this sort of sense that, all the great innovation happens in the United States and that Europe has sort of lagged behind. And I think that debate is actually now becoming more intense because Europe clearly is going through sort of some difficult, I don't know how closely you follow this, but, when they're closing car factories in Germany and stuff like that, you really begin to wonder. And if you look at the growth in things like AI, there is a European dimension, but the Americans seem to be, far ahead. So there is a lot of soul searching in the European Union about this. Now, I mean, as members of the European Union will always sort of say, we're all part of the European Union. Okay, the European Union doesn't completely impose. I mean, we're there as participants to discuss, and of course, bigger countries may have greater sway or whatever like that. But I mean, I think when a country like Ireland has perspectives on these sort of things, really our job is not just to sort of take what comes from the European Union, but make sure we have a voice, and then also to form alliances with like-minded countries. Okay. And I'm going to say, I'm looking at the ambassador who does not have to comment on anything I say and is perfectly open to denying that I said this. But one of the unfortunate things about the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, okay, was that in a lot of debates of this nature, in terms of the philosophical perspective on issues like deregulation and the role of the state, Ireland was actually quite close to the United Kingdom, and probably closer to the United Kingdom than we would be to France. And so when the United Kingdom left, Ireland lost a very significant ally, actually, in the European Union. And that wasn't something we talked about a whole range of other things, but that was actually a very, very sort of critical issue for us. So I think there's an ongoing sort of challenge for Ireland in that. But I mean, to be clear, I think the benefits of the European Union to Ireland have been so enormous that any sort of discussions I'm talking about, those discussions and those disputes will be held and the fight will be fought within the European Union. And then whatever the discussion is, because I don't think there's ever, but the likelihood of any sort of exit is essentially negligible. And on the future, yes, deglobalization is the, it's a real issue. Our finance minister, he always gives a speech where he talks about the 4D. So I'm not going to remember all of them, but there's digitalization, demography, meaning population aging, deglobalization, and I think there's a 4D, but I can't remember what the 4D is. But there's no doubt about it. I mean, we touched on some of these issues earlier. Free trade got a kind of a bad press for quite a long time, including in the United States. And I think it was precisely because of this sort of sense that there were winners and losers as a result of free trade. And a lot of countries were really weak in insulating certain groups from the vagaries of free trade. And I think it's fair to say that was one of the factors that gave rise to Donald Trump. So Ireland has been a huge beneficiary of the inflows of capital, exporting and everything like that. So I think we do worry about this, that if we were so successful as globalization was on the rise, is there a chance that we would suffer on the way down? I think absolutely, and it's back to those issues again of the things we need to worry cautious about. So very good questions. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Very good answers.
Thank you so much. So now we will invite to you to raise the hands to ask question if there is somebody there, but I have one question and I have a little power too. So my question is, did your country or did you sacrifice any sector to achieve these goals?
Yes. Now it goes back a lot, but I mean, if you go back to say even the 1950s and the 1960s, there was a domestic manufacturing base in Ireland that essentially it was completely lost. Okay, so it did, over time result in losses. So yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Anyone? Yes, all right, Guillermo. Maybe you can introduce yourself so he knows from whom is coming with.
Yes, my name is Guillermo Stanley. Alan, Ireland has always been one of the countries that opposed to the Mercosur European Union agreement. I always thought that the agro industry business, having counter seasons in Ireland, Argentina, Uruguay, we could come to agreements to export same products to same markets. I would like to know your opinion.
Yes, again, a very good question. I mean, just to not correct, but I mean, you'd be able to say that Ireland is opposed to the deal. Okay, I mean, certain groups within Ireland are opposed to the deal. I mean, I think the government generally, have signed up and supported, but they are under severe political pressure on this. Okay, and it is absolutely the case that the agricultural lobby in Ireland is dead set against this deal. And they, I mean, this is again a very familiar territory to be in, that you have a group of people who feel threatened by it. I have no doubt that Irish consumers in general would benefit enormously from being able to purchase Argentinian beef and whatever else would come with it. So there would be, on average, there would be a great benefit to the Irish economy and a great benefit in Europe. But we have a small group of farmers who feel threatened. And as ever in these situations, the small group have much more of an incentive and you understand much more about this to really get kind of worked up about it and to develop the political support. So there is a very strong lobby, farming lobby in Ireland who will oppose this. I've no doubt I don't think they're going to be convinced that this is a good idea. And very often in these situations, groups lobby very intensively because they'll be fearful that this is just the first trade deal that's attacked, but the next one will be with Australia, New Zealand, or the United States, or you know what I mean? That it's all part of an effort, and then you get sort of exaggerated claims like this is all part of the movement to remove agriculture from Ireland. And like, you know the sort of public debate that's there. So ultimately, I think it'll be up to the Irish government, in a sense, to face down these sort of difficulties. And to sort of say, look, on balance, this is really positive, and this is something we should do. And again, trade deals like this, it's partly about the narrow issue of the trade deal, but it's much more about the development of stronger economic ties in a much broader way. And I think most Irish people would actually be in favor of that. But it's just a question, will those who are in favor of it express their enthusiasm compared to those who are against?
Thank you.
There was a question over there. Yes, you. Okay.
Well, hello, I am Donas. I study economics at university. And my question was related to what we were saying about comparing Argentina and Ireland and how maybe Ireland is in some way like a possible model for Argentina. My question would be like, except for the fact that Argentina is not part of the European Union, don't you think that maybe the size of Argentina, the population or the sectors in Argentina maybe wouldn't be able for Argentina to maybe replicate the model of Ireland, and instead of maybe going 8% annually as it did with Ireland, you would get maybe like 1 or 2% into consideration that the economy is way bigger and the diversity of the economy and population is also different to Ireland, that maybe it could be compared to other countries that are more allowed with foreign direct investments, such as Singapore or the United Arab Emirates. Like Argentina could replicate that. Do you think that it could be it's way similar, or do you think that these differences are way too big?
Yeah, okay, so always with these sort of things, you don't want to push the comparisons to a ridiculous degree, okay? And clearly there are very different circumstances, very, very different histories. And if I can just take sort of one example you mentioned, I mean, Argentina is not going to be a member of the European Union, you know what I mean? And Mercosur, of course, is a very, very different sort of area. But let me just share a thought which is along the following lines, okay? And like I talked about some of the positives of the European Union. And I think then the challenge is, well, could a country like Argentina sort of almost self-impose some of the disciplines that descend on Ireland as a result of European Union membership? And one issue is around like fiscal policy management. And I don't know the case in Argentina, but certainly throughout Europe and a lot of other countries, there's been a growth of independent fiscal councils. Okay, so I mean, we're very familiar now with the notion of independent central banks. And, it's well understood that it's a good idea that you have an agency that's independent of the government that takes decisions on things like interest rates. And, if you go to the Bank of England, the ECB, the Fed in the United States, these are very independent organizations. When it comes to fiscal policy, we've tended not to set up agencies that try and sort of impose an independent discipline around this. But increasingly, countries are doing it. Okay, so rather than having a situation in which the IMF have to come in every few years to impose, or the markets impose fiscal discipline, could Argentina develop a new body, a fiscal council, that would look more whatever, forensically at the public finances, do things like take over sort of the forecasting, both of the macroeconomic variables, but also of the fiscal variables, and have the authority to impose fiscal rules, for example, to say, well, the deficit actually can't go beyond certain limits. So that's just one sort of small example of a situation in which you're not trying to mirror everything. You're trying to look at sort of some of the value that Ireland, in a sense, extracts from European membership, and then saying, well, is that sort of something that we could do? So it's just an example, but I think one of the interesting things is to think through what the other sort of parallels are. And I mean, again, this has only struck me since I've been here, that notion of having a societal vision of where the economy needs to go. Okay, and again, I know we talked about it a little bit. I talked in terms of Ireland and having a degree of sort of political unanimity around things. But I think it is broader than that, that if you have a shared vision of where you want to go and how you think you should get there, bringing on board people like the trade unions and others, that's a really, valuable thing to do. And sorry, I'm rambling here for a second, but I mean, one other thing is in Ireland for many years, we have had very close discussions between the government, the unions, the employers, and indeed the farmers and other group, all on an ongoing effort to try and keep some sort of a social consensus together. And it strikes me, I don't know how feasible it would be in Argentina, okay, given the differences that are there. But it seems like something that could happen. Maybe Carrie could organize it.
You can try. Okay. There's one question if somebody wants to make a question. Yes, please. Oh, sorry. I have to, yes.
Yes. Yes, first, very interesting talk is explained a lot, but I'm still not quite clear.
Sorry, can you introduce yourself, please?
My source website time.
Okay.
So very interesting talk, but I'm still not quite clear on the birth of the Celtic Tiger, because you yourself said that Ireland was now out of looking economy as early as the 1960s. So I came back to have a history lecture. John Joseph Lee of County Kerry, who you perhaps know, who was insisting, at least back then, that Ireland was already turning around as early as Sean Mass. And yet, in 1973, you joined the EU. But by 1989, Ireland has been in the EU for 16 years, and you are thinking of leaving Ireland never to return. So it clearly hadn't clicked by then. So the question would be, when did it click and how?
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good question. And you're absolutely right. Ireland did start to grow in the 1960s. Okay, so my starting point wasn't entirely accurate. But that growth that was observed in the 1960s through policy mistakes essentially halted to an extent into the 70s and certainly into the 1980s. Okay, so sensible policies were being implemented, I think, earlier on, but there were plenty of non-sensible policies, so things were delayed. The phrase the Celtic Tiger really describes the situation from the sort of the mid-90s into the mid-2000s. Okay, and the phrase was coined around that time. And I think that is the period where a lot of the sensible policies were in place, by which I mean the sort of the trade orientation to foreign direct investment. But the fiscal situation had been remedied essentially through the later part of the 1990s and the early 2000s. So in a sense, those additional things that were dampening activity were lifted. And if you look at the graph, you sort of see modest growth and sort of bobbing around a little bit at 60s, 70s, stagnation in the 1980s. But the graph really starts lifting off then in the 1990s. And we have to be very, very honest about this, though, that's the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. Okay, but in the latter part of the 2000s, it was growth that it was essentially fueled by the borrowed money that I talked about earlier on. Okay, so it was a sort of it was growth, but it wasn't good quality or sustainable growth. So then we had the dip, and then we sort of carried on again.
No, wait.
Okay, so the question was how important
Okay.
was the euro? Actually, now you raise a difficult question. Okay, so let me, can I just say, it'll take a minute, okay, because
Yes.
it's slightly complicated.
Yes.
The build up to the euro, okay, involved, okay, and this is the bad bit of the story. All right, so the build up to the euro and the sort of the early days of the euro required interest rates in Ireland to converge towards the European interest rates. Okay, and then the euro came into existence around like 99, 2000. Okay, and for a lot of the period of the 2000s, Ireland's interest rate was then set by Frankfurt. Okay, the economic collapse that happened probably would not have happened if we had not been in the euro. Okay, but it wasn't about the single currency. It's that if we had our own monetary policy during this period, any sensible central banker looking at the increase in house prices around that time and the sort of rapid growth in the economy, okay, a sensible central banker would have done what central bankers do, which is to dampen demand of the economy, and interest rates would have increased. Okay, so you can really make a strong case that at that point, actually, the euro was unhealthy. Let me just like that. Once you start abstracting from that or taking away from that particular difficulty, the euro, I mean, I think it removed exchange rate risk, which I think was probably positive for investors into the Irish economy. Interest rates were probably lower than they otherwise would have been. So for more normal periods, I think this was a positive. So you can make the case that there were positives. But just a sort of a rounding off piece of this, Ireland's decision to join the euro, I would argue, was as much political as economic. Ireland always wanted to be in the sort of the front row of European integration. And again, there were very good reasons for that, because the entire project had been very, very positive for Ireland. And that's why Ireland wanted to be sort of very, very front and center. So, sorry, that was a bit of a rambling answer, but it was a more important, or more difficult question than you might realize.
Thank you so much. Marcelo, do you want to make some final comments maybe? Or?
Just to thank you, Alan. It was a great presentation. To say that there are many things that you explained that are very helpful for Argentina, many things to implement that you could implement, and there are some differences also. But the main point is that you and Alan produced a lot of reforms so rapidly. You did it so fast. And this is something that could provide us some optimism in terms of the reforms we must implement. Well, we can do that, and we can get fast results considering your experience.
Alan or Ambassador, do you want to say some final words? No? So, okay. So I will say thank you so much for joining us today, and we will hope to have, or to help to have a stranger relationship, and just believe in Kari, and we believe in Ireland.
Yeah, excellent. Great presentation.
Really enjoyed it. No, it's good. Thanks for your clever interrogation. Thanks so much for coming.